Central to the idea of the American dream lies an assumption that we all have an equal opportunity to generate the kind of wealth that brings meaning to the words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, boldly penned in the Declaration of Independence. The American dream portends that with hard work, a person can own a home, start a business, and grow a nest egg for generations to draw upon. This belief, however, has been defied repeatedly by the United States government's own decrees that denied wealth-building opportunities to Black Americans. Today, the average white family has roughly 10 times the amount of wealth as the average Black family. White college graduates have over 7 times more wealth than Black college graduates. Making the American dream an equitable reality demands the same U.S. government that denied wealth to Blacks restore that deferred wealth through reparations to their descendants in the form of individual cash payments in the amount that will close the Black-white racial wealth divide. Additionally, reparations should come in the form of wealth-building opportunities that address racial disparities in education, housing, and business ownership. Given the lingering legacy of slavery on the racial wealth gap, the monetary value we know that was placed on enslaved Blacks, the fact that other groups have received reparations, and the fact that Blacks were originally awarded reparations only to have them rescinded, provide overwhelming evidence that it is time to pay reparations to the descendants of enslaved Blacks. Welcome to yet another episode on the unpaid invoice of history, reparations for the ravages caused by slavery. Before we continue, don't forget to support our works by hitting that like button in front of you. Share with your families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and kindly subscribe to help in building the rising membership of this channel. Your support means a lot to us. In 1860, over $3 billion was the value assigned to the physical bodies of enslaved Black Americans to be used for free labor and production. This was more money than was invested in factories and railroads combined. In 1861, the value placed on cotton produced by enslaved Blacks was $250 million. Slavery enriched white slave owners and their descendants, and it fueled the country's economy while suppressing wealth building for the enslaved. The United States has yet to compensate descendants of enslaved Black Americans for their labor. Nor has the federal government atoned for the lost equity from anti-Black housing, transportation, and business policy. Slavery, Jim Crow segregation, anti-Black practices like redlining, and other discriminatory public policies in criminal justice and education have robbed Black Americans of the opportunities to build wealth, defined as assets minus debt, afforded to their white peers. Bootstrapping isn't going to erase racial wealth divides. As economists William Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton point out in their 2018 report, What We Get Wrong About Closing the Wealth Gap, Blacks cannot close the racial wealth gap by changing their individual behavior, that is, by assuming more personal responsibility or acquiring the portfolio management insights associated with financial literacy. In fact, white high school dropouts have more wealth than Black college graduates. Moreover, the racial wealth gap did not result from a lack of labor. Rather, it came from a lack of financial capital. Not only do racial wealth disparities reveal fallacies in the American dream, the financial and social consequences are significant and wide-ranging. Wealth is positively correlated with better health, educational, and economic outcomes. Furthermore, assets from homes, stocks, bonds, and retirement savings provide a financial safety net for the inevitable shocks to the economy and personal finances that happen throughout a person's lifespan. Recessions impact everyone, but wealth is distributed quite unevenly in the US. The woeful inadequacy of a government-sponsored safety net was made apparent in the wake of economic disasters like the 2008 housing crisis and natural ones like Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Those who can draw upon the equity in a home, savings, and securities are able to recover faster after economic downturns than those without wealth. Disparities in access to healthcare, along with inequities in economic policies, combine to make Black people more vulnerable to negative consequences than white individuals. The United States and governments around the world have paid reparations even when they had no part in inflicting the damage. So why is it that Black Americans haven't been compensated for centuries of slavery followed by decades of segregation? This was the question addressed by a panel of experts brought together by the New York State Bar Association's Task Force on Racism, Social Equity, and the Law on Monday night. The discussion took place 2 days after 10 people were gunned down in a supermarket in a Black neighborhood in Buffalo by a white supremacist who scrawled, "Here's your reparations," on his assault rifle. Author A. Kirsten Mullen pointed out that the United States government has paid reparations to Japanese families who were interned during World War II, families who lost loved ones during the September 11th attacks, and to Americans held hostage in Iran. The federal government even paid reparations to slave owners for the emancipation of their slaves in the midst of the Civil War. Thomas Kramer, associate professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Connecticut, detailed how Germany reimbursed victims of the Holocaust and how Haiti was forced to pay reparations to slave owners. Albany Law School professor Anthony Paul Farley, a former federal prosecutor, said that may be due to the fact that the systems of oppression that shackle and demean Black Americans remain in place. Even if checks were cut tomorrow for the highest amount you could imagine, there are procedures in place for white power to recoup it all the day after tomorrow, said Farley. Farley described how Black Americans face higher arrest rates, lower wages, and a more fragile economic existence than their white counterparts. He attributed that to systemic defamation by the United States government of Black Americans. Our government has a way of teaching everyone Black people's place in society, he said. We as lawyers are all familiar with reputational harm. We know what defamation is, we know what it costs if you have a bad name. But we don't think of the ways our government has for all these years been busy producing a bad name for Black people. Black people have such a bad name that before a Black person even gets to a job interview, or walks into a dealership to buy a car, or walks down the street, way before they have ever arrived, there are myths and stories that have formed around them, and people have natural reactions to that. Farley said that defamation comes in the form of how the government sanctioned slavery and then segregation, and how the legal, education, financial and medical systems in the country treat Blacks. William A. Darity Jr., a professor of public policy at Duke University, said that many Americans have come to see Black suffering as morally correct. If we introduce a wealth program, we have to prepare for a violent response, said Darity. 30% of the population will resist any positive social change on behalf of Black people. Darity and Mullen are both pro bono counsel to efforts in California to study reparations. Their conclusion from their involvement is that reparations must be made on a national level. They say the scope of payments needed to address the wealth gap between white and Black Americans eclipses even the largest state budgets. Darity said that using the formula of 4 acres and a mule, which was promised to freed slaves by General William T. Sherman during the Civil War, but later reversed by President Andrew Johnson, would necessitate a reparations fund of between $1 to $3 trillion. However, Darity noted that 4 acres and a mule was only one way to measure reparations, and it fails to take into account centuries of negative actions taken by the US government against Blacks. This is only one component shaping the wealth gap. There are still the consequences of discriminatory home ownership programs, the destructive effect on Black businesses of the Federal Highway Program, and much more. Aside from the sheer size of payments, Darity and Mullen say that tracing the descendants of slaves and singling out those responsible in one state is difficult. California, for example, only has a short history of slavery due to its being founded later in the life of the nation. And as Farley posits, Black Americans as a whole, regardless of whether they are descended from slaves, have borne the brunt of racist policies and the government's defamation. Asked where he would begin to implement reparations, Farley noted his credentials as a former federal prosecutor before advocating for the abolition of prison and the police. We know prison doesn't make people better. We've essentially abolished prison for white people, and yet we incarcerate a higher portion pro capita than the Soviet Union, than apartheid South Africa. We incarcerate more per capita than the People's Republic of China. Chains look good on Black people to most Americans, he said. For the descendants of the 12.5 million Blacks who were shipped in chains from Western Africa, America has come to a genetic birth defect when it comes to the question of race, as stated recently by the US Representative Hakeem Jeffries. If America is to atone for this defect, reparations for Black Americans is definitely part of the healing and reconciliation process. Black Americans are the only group that has not received reparations for state-sanctioned racial discrimination, while slavery afforded some white families the ability to accrue tremendous wealth. It is important to note, nonetheless, that American slavery was particularly brutal. About 15% of the enslaved shipped from Western Africa died during transport. The enslaved were regularly beaten and lynched for frivolous infractions. Slavery also disrupted families, as 1 in 3 marriages were split up, and 1 in 5 children were separated from their parents. The case for reparations can be made on economic, social, and moral grounds. The United States had multiple opportunities to atone for slavery, each a missed chance to make the American dream a reality, but has yet to undertake significant action. A major instance was right after the Civil War, when Union leaders concluded that each black family was to receive 40 acres and mules left over from the war. General William Sherman had signed Field Order 15 to this effect and allocated 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land to black families. Yet, after President Abraham Lincoln's assassination, President Andrew Johnson reversed Field Order 15 and returned land back to former slave owners. Instead of giving blacks the means to support themselves, the federal government empowered former enslavers. For example, in Washington, D.C., slave owners were actually paid reparations for lost property, that is, the formerly enslaved. This practice was also common in nearby states. Many black Americans with limited work options returned as sharecroppers to till the same land for the very slave owners to whom they were once enslaved. Slave owners not only made money off the chattel enslavement of black Americans, but they then made money multiple times over off the land that the formerly enslaved had no choice but to work. There's never a bad time to do what's morally right, but the United States has had prime opportunities to atone for slavery. In the 1930s, the United States was reeling from the 1929 stock market crash and was firmly engulfed in the Great Depression. The Franklin Roosevelt administration implemented a series of policies as part of his New Deal legislation, estimated to cost roughly $50 billion then, to catapult the country out of depression. Current estimates price the New Deal at about $50 trillion. Two particular policies of the New Deal fell short in redressing America's racial wrongs: the GI Bill and Social Security. Though white and black Americans fought in World War II, black veterans could not redeem their post-war benefits like their white peers. While the GI Bill was mandated federally, it was implemented locally. The presence of racial housing covenants and redlining among local municipalities prohibited blacks from utilizing federal benefits. White soldiers were afforded the opportunity to build wealth by sending themselves and their children to college and by obtaining housing and small business grants. Regarding Social Security, two key professions that would have improved equity in America were excluded from the legislation: domestic and farm workers. These omissions effectively excluded 60% of blacks across the US and 75% in southern states who worked in these occupations. Roosevelt bargained these exclusionary provisions in the legislation on the backs of black veterans and workers in order to propel mostly white America out of the Great Depression. There are other policies and practices that contributed to racial wealth gap. Government-sanctioned discrimination related to the 1862 Homestead Act, redlining, restrictive covenants, and convict leasing blocked blacks from the ability to gain wealth at similar rates as whites. Separate from slavery, damages should be awarded to black people who were harmed by these policies and practices. The U.S. government owes lost wages as well as damages to the people it helped enslave. In addition to the lost wages, the cumulative amount of restitution for individuals should eliminate the racial wealth gap that currently exists. According to the Federal Reserve's most recent numbers in 2016, based on the Survey of Consumer Finances, white families had the highest median family wealth at $171,000, compared to black and Hispanic families, which had $17,600 and $20,700 respectively. Taking a look at some good objectives which promise to make a great impact in implementing reparations is the aspect of 1. College tuition. College tuition to 4-year or 2-year colleges and universities for descendants of enslaved black Americans is a great step. People should be able to use the tuition remission to obtain a bachelor's degree or an associate's vocational or technical degree. Tuition should be available for public or private universities. Considering the racial gap in the ability to obtain degrees at private schools, this part of the package will further help to reduce racial disparities by affording more social network access and opportunity structures. 2. Student loan debt. This is another great step in the right direction of reparations, as student loan debt continues to be a significant barrier to wealth creation for black college graduates. Among 25 to 55-year-olds, that is about 40% of blacks compared to 30% of whites have student loan debt. Blacks also have nearly $45,000 of student loan debt compared to about $30,000 for whites. Recent research finds that blacks are more likely to be allocated unsubsidized loans. Furthermore, graduates of historically black colleges and universities, compared to predominantly white institutions, are more likely to receive subprime loans with higher interest rates. Universities including and Princeton Theological Seminary, which is the second oldest seminary in the country, are aiming to atone for the fact that the sale of slaves helped to fortify their university endowments and establish them as elite institutions of higher education on a global scale. Descendants of the slaves sold by Georgetown and Princeton Theological Seminary are now entitled to full rights and benefits bestowed by those universities to obtain degrees across the higher education pipeline. The Virginia state legislature voted for some of its state universities to atone for slavery with reparations. Other universities, along with state legislatures and the federal government, should follow suit. 3. Down payment and housing revitalization grants. Down payment grants will provide Black Americans with some initial equity in their homes relative to mortgage insurance loans. Housing revitalization grants will help Black Americans to refurbish existing homes in neighborhoods that have been neglected due to a lack of government and corporate investments in predominantly Black communities. Given recent settlements for predatory lending, low and fixed interest rates as well as property tax caps in areas in which housing prices are significantly devalued should be part of the package. After accounting for factors such as housing quality, neighborhood quality, education, and crime, owner-occupied homes in Black neighborhoods are undervalued by $48,000 per home on average, amounting to a whopping $156 billion that homeowners would have received if their homes were priced at market rates. As gentrification occurs, Blacks are typically priced out of neighborhoods they help to maintain, while the historical and current remnants of redlining and restrictive covenants inhibited investments. Some Black Americans are being forced from their family home of decades because of tax increases as neighborhoods are gentrified. This is an important point because some 2020 Democratic presidential candidates aim to redress the racial wealth gap by focusing on historically redlined districts. Perry's research shows that these policies fall short of capturing a large segment of Black Americans. 4. Business grants. Black-owned businesses are more likely to be located in predominantly Black neighborhoods that need the infrastructure and businesses. However, Black business owners are still less likely to obtain capital from banks to make their businesses successful. This reparations package for Black Americans is about restoring the wealth that has been extracted from Black people and communities. Still, reparations are all for naught without enforcement of anti-discrimination policies that remove barriers to economic mobility and wealth building. The architecture of the economy must change in order to create an equitable society. The racial wealth gap was created by racist policies. Federal intervention is needed to remove the racism that undergirds those policies. Reparations are payments, monetary and otherwise, given to a group that has suffered harm. For example, Japanese Americans who were interned in the United States during World War II have received reparations. While Americans generally think of reparations as monetary, Michelle Bachelet, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, in the office's June 1, 2021 annual report, states, "Measures taken to address the past should seek to transform the future. Structures and systems that were designed and shaped by enslavement, colonialism, and successive racially discriminatory policies and systems must be transformed." Reparations should not only be equated with financial compensation. They also comprise measures aimed at restitution, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition, including, for example, formal acknowledgement and apologies, memorialization, and institutional and educational reforms. Reparations are essential for transforming relationships of discrimination and inequity and for mutually committing to and investing in a stronger, more resilient future of dignity, equality, and non-discrimination for all. Reparatory justice requires a multi-pronged approach that is grounded in international human rights law. Reparations are one element of accountability and redress. For every violation, there should be repair of the harms caused through adequate, effective, and prompt reparation. Reparations help to promote trust in institutions and the social reintegration of people whose rights may have been discounted, providing recognition to victims and survivors as rights holders. President Obama outlined the political difficulty of reparations on his podcast with Bruce Springsteen, Renegades, Born in the USA. He said, "So, if you ask me theoretically, are reparations justified? The answer is yes. There's not much question that the wealth of this country, the power of this country was built in significant part, not exclusively, maybe not even the majority of it, but a large portion of it was built on the backs of slaves. What I saw during my presidency was the politics of white resistance and resentment, the talk of welfare queens and the talk of the undeserving poor, and the backlash against affirmative action. all that made the prospect of actually proposing any kind of coherent, meaningful reparations program struck me as, politically, not only a non-starter, but potentially counterproductive. We know the monetary value that was placed on enslaved blacks and the productivity of their labor, as well as the amount of the racial wealth gap. We've seen other groups receive restitutions while the federal government pulled back reparations for black Americans. Accordingly, if we want to close the racial wealth gap and live up to our moral creed to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, a federal reparations package for black Americans is in order. This package should include individual and collective public benefits that simultaneously builds wealth and eliminates debt among black citizens. We assert that it should be similar to the Harriet Tubman Community Investment Act, which was recently heard before the Maryland General Assembly, where Ray testified on its behalf. The Harriet Tubman Community Investment Act aims to atone for slavery and its legacy by addressing education, homeownership, and business ownership barriers. With April 4th marking the 52nd year since Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, we think it is appropriate to end with an oft-forgotten quote from Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech that he gave in 1963 in Washington, D.C. This statement is still one of the unfulfilled aspects of this policy-related speech. We have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. This brings us to the end of this video segment. Hope you find it of great interest. Tell us what you think in the comment section below. Your opinion counts a great deal. Don't forget also to support our works by hitting that like button in front of you, share information with families and friends to keep up the consciousness and responsibility in people, and subscribe to help in building the rising membership of this channel. Your support goes a long way. Thank you for watching.